Yeah, hello and welcome to this After Effects tutorial for mamoworld.com. My name is Matthias and today I want to give you an overview over the new camera bundle that is part of our eye expressions tool. This camera bundle currently contains several expressions to control the focus of the camera, so autofocus eye expressions, and then it also contains expressions that help you to distribute layers in 3D space to give your camera perspective sense of depth. So here we have an example of this. You can see here we have some scene that is built out of several images, and we are actually going to use this as an example. And the first thing that we want to understand is how to control the focus inside of this scene. If you go to the eye expressions library, you have here the camera bundle and it has these 4 expressions, and we're going to look at all of them. First, we want to look at the autofocus stuff. The one here is the most easy one, autofocus on point of interest. And this one is a little bit more complex, but really, really powerful. So I really encourage you to take a look at this, but we start with the simple one, with the point of interest. So to understand better what is going on, let's take a quick look at our composition. Our composition consists of a camera, and here's some null layers that we are going to look at later, and then different mountain layers for these different parts of the scenes here. So to make more clear what is happening here, maybe let's fit this, and if we deactivate them step by step, you can see this layer here are these mountains in the foreground, and then this here are the next layer of and so on and so on. And we are going to look later at how to distribute these layers in space, but for now let's just understand the autofocus. If we look at this from the top perspective, we have here our camera looking at the scene, and here we have the different mountain layers. So the first one is this one here in the foreground, and then here you've got the second one, and here the third one, and here the fourth one, and so forth. Now, the camera focus of your camera, you get these sharp or not so sharp views of your camera by enabling the depth of field. So here, if you turn depth of field off, you can see everything is in focus, everything is sharp. And if you say depth of field on and then play with the aperture setting and blur level, you will manage to get only certain parts in focus. And what is in focus you control with this focus distance here. And it is visualized here in the camera how this focus distance is working. So you can say, see now, for example, this layer here in the far background is in focus. And now if I change here the focus distance, you can see the focus is traveling, and now, for example, here this very foreground layer is in focus, and now this layer here is in focus. And of course you can control this manually by keyframing this property, but this gets very tedious if you start animating your camera or your layers. And the autofocus on point of interest does the following. Each camera has this point of interest, that's this point here, that you can grab, that tells where the camera should look. And with this autofocus on point of interest, you just apply this expression to the focus distance, and look what happens with our focus. Apply, it jumps to our point of interest. So this means if you set the point of interest such that it touches some layer, then this layer will be in focus automatically. So the focus here automatically follows your point of interest. Very easy, very basic. It has some offset parameter. Why is this useful? If you set this offset to, let's say, 100, look what happens here with the focus. If we apply it again, you can see the focus slightly jumped here. Maybe let's set it to 500 to see better what's happening. Now it's 500 pixels ahead of my point of interest. If I move my point of interest, the focus always stays 500 pixels before my point of interest. This is not so exciting by itself, but what you can use this for, usually I would keep this at 0. And then you can also start linking this here to a slider control to animate it over time. And the only thing where I think this makes really sense is you can link this offset to another slider. and then to this other slider, you apply a wiggle expression. And this is nice because then you can simulate some kind of pumping focus that is not yet sure where to focus. Yeah? So like wiggling the focus, you can do this with the help of this offset. I'm not going to show this in detail because I think the much better way in general to do autofocus is not with a point of interest thing, but here with the autofocus on layers eye expression. And what the autofocus on layers eye expression essentially does, it changes the meaning of your focus distance parameter of your camera. So imagine, wouldn't it be great if a value of 1 here would not mean that your focus distance is 1 pixel from the camera, but it would mean layer number 1 is in focus. Or if you set it to 5, it would mean layer number 5 should be in focus, and so on. So this would really simplify keyframing focus transitions from one layer to another one. This would just have one problem, and that is if you insert new layers, so the layer that was before layer number 4 is now layer number 5, for example, and then you would need to change all of these keyframes. And therefore, the autofocus on layers eye expression works with layer names. So here you can set, for example, which layer should be in focus when the focus distance is keyframed to something like 1. So 1, let's say the mountain 1 should be in focus. So we just enter here mountain 1. And then we say when we keyframe it to 2, mountain layer 2 should be in focus. And then for keyframe value 3, mountain 3 should be in focus. And here mountain 4 and mountain 5. And there are more focus layers. So let me just undock this panel here to make it a bit larger. So as you can see if you need more than 5, and we have 6 mountain layers here, you just go to more focus layers and there are more of them. And we have even more here. Let me just move this out of the way, select the focus distance and apply, and see what is happening here. Yeah, you can see now the value goes to 4,900 something pixels, but if I click, it says 1, because focus layer 1 is in focus. Now, if you want to focus here the second mountain, we just keyframe this here to 2. And if we look at our camera, you can see now this here is in focus. And if we set it to 3, this layer is in focus. 4, this layer goes in focus, and so on. And you can also easily keyframe it. So let's say, now you can see the far background is in focus. Let's say we want to start with the third layer being in focus. This one here. And we set a keyframe and say this should be until here. And from here to here, we want to have a nice focus transition. Or actually notice here that I have animated my camera. And you can see while I animate, also the focus distance animates to ensure that here we come closer to this mountain. And so the focus distance goes down. Yeah, as the camera moves towards the mountain. And note that here the focus plane always stays focused on this layer. Yeah, pretty nice, pretty automatic. And now if you say, okay, from here now I want to have a focus transition. Let's say from this point we now want to focus here the background. So we move this point, this keyframe here, and say until here we should transition to, let's say, not having layer 3 but layer 5 in focus. So we just add here another keyframe with 5, and now you can see the background is in focus, and from here to here we have a nice focus transition. And from here on, no matter how I move my camera, you can see the background nicely stays in focus. Okay, so that's essentially the most important functionality of this. So very convenient. Just enter here the names of the layers that you want to keep in focus and then keyframe your focus distance. If you want to have more control, a question is how to fine-tune the transition. Yeah, if you want to say, I want to control how exactly to transition from layer 3 in focus to layer 5 in focus, you might get the idea to try something like adding here easy ease keyframes or something like this, but this is not working. And the reason why it's not working is because let's say we have here layer 3 in focus and here layer 5 in focus. And let's take a look at the graph actually. So you can see here layer 3 is in focus, here layer 5 is in focus. It would mean in between layer 4 would be in focus, yeah? And layer 4 can be an arbitrary layer no matter what you enter here, yeah? Depending on what you enter here. Layer 4 not necessarily must be located in space between these two. And this is something you definitely do not want. And this is something the eye expression does not do. So if you go from 3 to 5, it does not focus layer 4 in between unless it's in space really in between the two. Yeah. And therefore you cannot use these easing stuff and use here the graph editor to control your transition. But you can do something much easier because the eye expression itself has some predefined transition types. You can say, I want the default is ease transition. Yeah. And then you can do a linear transition or an ease in or an ease out transition. You can just set it here and then all transitions you do here are nicely eased or linear or whatever you want. I think in 90% of the situations, these predefined easing types are perfect for what you need, but sometimes you want to have even more control, and this is where the manual transition type comes into play. This one is a little bit more complicated. For it, you first need to create a new layer, a null object, and this is just because we need to create a slider, and it has to live on some layer, and it cannot be on a camera, technically. So let's call this just transition control, and we select it and then click here on the link button for the link manual transition, and this asks us whether we want to create a slider, and we say yes. And now you can see it is linked here, and we have on this layer here some effect that is called link manual transition of autofocus. Okay, how is this working now? Let's move this out of the, or let's actually apply this first. So we select our focus distance again and apply the changes. And now it works as follows. So for each camera transition that we make, we need to add keyframes to this slider. And currently we have the following focus camera transitions. First, here the layer number 3 is in focus. Then here layer number 5 is in focus, and I added here some additional keyframes that from layer number 5 it stays in focus here, and now it transitions here to layer number 2 in the very foreground. So these are just 4 keyframes on the focus distance. Yeah, here's layer number 2, for example, in focus. And now we need to add corresponding keyframes to our slider here. And we add it as follows. At the beginning of every transition, we set it to 0. And at the end of every transition, like here, we set it to 100. And so let's do the same for the second transition. It starts here. We set it to 0. 0 means like beginning of transition. And then we go to here and set it here to the end to 100. So, and now we have here going from 0 to 100 once and here going from 0 to 100 once. These values in between essentially do not matter. To make it a bit cleaner, we can toggle this here as a hold keyframe, but in general, here we don't have any focus transition at all, yeah, because we just transition from here to here and then from here to here, so these keyframes do not matter. And now we can ease this however we like to control our to fine control how exactly it travels from the one focus point to the other. So for example, we can just select this point and right click and say keyframe assistant easy ease out. And then we can drag this here, for example, and say, okay, the transition should be such that this layer that is currently in focus should be in focus pretty long. So you can see here it's still almost entirely in focus, although it already moved away a bit. You can see this if you are looking here. Yeah, it's pretty close to this layer, still this focus, for a pretty long time. And now from here on, essentially, it starts pretty quickly going to this next focus point here. And now here the second one is in focus. So in other words, you can adjust this curve here to control your transition. Yeah, here you now have a basic linear transition. Yeah, if we go to the middle here, it's roughly in the middle between the first layer that it's focused and the second layer that it's focused, and so on. So in general, this manual slider works as follows, or manual control of your how to exactly transition from one to the other focus point. Do not do any easing on the focus distance itself. It will not work, but instead do the easing by creating such a slider. Link this slider here, choose here manual, and then you can ease this slider however you want. And this also has one big advantage in my opinion, and this is these values are always between 0 and 100. Yeah? In other words, in this transition here, the focus distance goes from 7,000 something to 2,800 something. And if you would control your focus manually, you could change, or you could set here some easing on these values, but the problem is whenever you change these values because you moved your layer or your camera, all your easing also slightly changes with it. And you always have to update and fine-tune it. And here you have these two aspects clearly separated, because if you move your camera, this curve that goes from 0 to 100, or if you move your goal that you want to focus, can stay as it is. Yeah, here you define the characteristics of the camera transition or of the focus transition, and here the actual distances, the actual values are computed automatically. Okay, that's it for the autofocus on layers eye expression, and now let's take a look at how we can set up these scenes with multiple layers in space really easily. When you want to create a 3D scene like this one, you usually start with a 2D image that consists of several layers, as we have here, and of course at the beginning all these layers are 2D layers, and if we make them 3D, they are all in one plane. So you need to take, for example, the last layer and shift it back. And after you shifted it back, you also need to scale it up again to fit the original size. And this is a bit of tweaking, and it's difficult to really get it in exactly the same size as it had before. And all of this goes much easier with the help of the auto scale eye expression. So let's see how this one is working. I undo these changes I did before, but of course I still want all of these layers to be 3D layers, and now let's see how this is looking like. Here they are all in one plane, and all I need to set is this offset here. So for example, we can say this sixth layer here should have an offset of 2000 pixel, and I apply. And you can see here in the image nothing changed, but if I look here, you can see it moved far away to the back and simultaneously got scaled, such that it looks as before, but now it's sitting here. And now you can take, for example, here the fifth mountain layer and say this one should not have a different distance of 2000, but 1500. Apply, and it jumps here. And you can see in this perspective, it didn't change at all. But if I move now my camera, let's say I move it here a bit to the side, now you can see that these layers are actually placed way behind the others, and therefore you have this nice perspective shift that you are interested in. Another thing is, you can see if we go now back here to the first frame, sometimes there is this strange issue that the cache is mixed up on my machine here, and you can do this by purging all memory, and we are back to normal. Usually you would just do this for all the layers and then just bake your result. But let me first show you these advanced options here before we do this. The first one I want to cover here is the offset multiplier. This thing must live on its own layer or at some slider, and we cannot add sliders to cameras, therefore we create a new layer for it. So we create a null object and call this distance controller. And we select this distance controller and link it here. And it asks, do you want to create a new slider? And I say yes. And now we have here our effect slider. And by default, I should set this to 1. And now, if I reapply my eye expression and say this first one here should have 2000 distance, apply. Yeah, it doesn't change. Second one 1500, for example. And then let's say the fourth one here, let me finish this, is at 1000. So it jumps here. This one here goes to, let's say, 500. And let's say this one here should stay where it is. And this one here should go to minus 500. Minus 500 like this. So it jumps in front of it, so jumps towards the camera. And now the nice thing is with our slider, we can animate it. So currently it is set to 1. If we say, oh, we actually want a bit larger distance, we can set it to say 1.5 or 1.5. And now you can see all the layers jumped a bit more because like the original offset values for all of them were now multiplied with 1.5. And you can also fine-tune this here. Let's say if you want to have no depth at all, we can have 0. And now we can also animate this, for example. We can say at the beginning, they should all live in this plane here. And then after 1 second, they should be at their original distance. And now you can see here they come closer, closer, closer. And now they move out again. Yeah, if you look at here, you can see what is happening. So in other words, with this offset multiplier, you can control the distance of all layers after you have set the offset for each of them individually. So you can like determine the overall depth of your scene. Another important point is your reference frame. And this is like the point in time at which the layers should look as if they didn't change at all. And this gets relevant if you want to move your camera over time. So let's say we are happy with the distribution of these layers here, and maybe get rid of these slider keyframes here again, set this to 1. So we are happy with this distribution of the layers. So we can select all these layers, hit EE to reveal exactly all layers where the expression is applied to, or all properties where the expression is applied to. So this expression you can see is applied to position and scale. And then I set the work area to cover only the very first frame because I want to bake now my keyframes here, and I only want to generate 1 keyframe because this is enough. So I select position and scale for all of them and click bake. And of course I get an error because the second layer I didn't apply the expression on, so it tells me for this layer 2 it cannot create the expressions, but for the other ones the expressions are now the keyframes are generated. So we have these as keyframes, and now we can even click here on the stopwatch to get rid of the keyframes, and now we have perfectly normal position and scale values here that I can adjust manually later as I want, and I don't have all these expression active anymore, so they are all disabled now, which is nice because now everything works a bit faster again. And now let's say we want to animate our camera over time. So let's say I move the position of my camera to be at the beginning here, and then later it should be here, for example. And then let's also move the point of interest for it. So at the beginning, it should point here, and at the current position, it should rather look in this direction here. Okay, and now let's say we want to insert here some new images now. So then we can easily do this with the auto scale eye expression. Let me first get some new layers, and for this I just go to my project where I have here another copy of my composition with these original layers, and let's say we just want to insert here these last 2 background layers. I copy them, Control C, and go here and paste them, and so far these are just 2D layers, and maybe give them some meaningful name. Let's say part 2 1, and this here is part 2 2. Yeah, these are just these layers now for this very background and this here a little bit closer part. And now I turn these into 3D layers. And now, of course, they are not showing up at this point here. So a nice trick to get them here is to parent them temporarily to my camera. So I select them, parent them to the camera. And now if I move, my camera move, you can see here they nicely move with the camera. Yeah? And now I can also unparent them again. So set the parent here to none. And now if we move back, they stay where they are. But obviously they are not yet shifted in depth. Yeah? These layers here are shifted nicely in depth. And these layers here are still in one depth. So how to do this? We go to the eye expression, and now the important thing is if you want to shift your layers, you don't want to shift them now in this direction here, but you want to shift them in this direction. Yeah? And how do you do this? You do this by choosing the correct reference frame. So you say, use the view of my camera not at frame number 0, but at frame number 50 in this case. Yeah, this is frame number 0, and here we are at frame number 50. So if we say at frame number 50, please move it 2000 pixels to the back, and click here on apply, it jumps 2000 pixels to the back. And then we can say, you can see here, it shifted now in this direction and not in this direction. And now we can do the same for this one and say this one should have 1500 pixels, apply, and you can see this one now nicely shifted here 1500 pixels. And obviously I have to do some work now to make these different scenes here fit, but I think you get the general idea. Yeah? If you move your camera and want to insert layers later step by step, all you need to do is choose the correct reference frame, and once you like their position, select their position and scale, bake it to one keyframe, and then they stay placed wherever they want to be. Okay, there's one more additional parameter, and this is the camera. Usually this works with the active camera, but you can also make it work with any custom camera. So I can then write here something like my camera name, and then you name your camera my camera name, and then it will use the point of view of this camera. And this is nice. If you have several perspectives, you can, for example, also decide to use one camera for your camera animation, and then one camera to determine this view here, how these are projected, and then another camera to determine how these layers in this view are projected. Then you are a bit more flexible to play with different cameras. But in general, I think it's perfectly fine to stick with the active camera, and just make sure before you create your depths, or before you shift your layers and depths, choose the correct reference frame to make sure they are shifted in the correct direction. So in general, the auto-scale eye expression is great whenever you need to shift layers in 3D space and want to have full control about how much exactly you shift them. And then as an alternative, we also have the auto-scale random, and this one is perfect if you want to shift many elements simultaneously and don't really care for each individual one how far you shift it. So this is in particular nice with texts. In this composition here, we have camera together with some camera animation that is keyframed here, and then we have this text, and for the eye expressions, you can see each letter is an individual layer, and then the camera bundle is one layer in total. So, and we have a nice camera animation where you rotate here the camera first up, and then we rotate it back again, and then at the end we rotate it here to the side. And now let's say we want to create an interesting animation where when this, or a text transition, where when this text rotates to the side, you actually notice that it's not all in one plane as it's currently looking like, but we want to distribute these layers in 3D space. So shift them to the back and again scale them up simultaneously such that from this perspective here, they look as if they would be all lying in one plane, but they are not because we scale and shift them. How is this working? Well, It's exactly as before, as with the autoscale I expression, except that you don't have one offset value to enter, but a minimum offset and a maximum offset, and you apply it to all of them. So, and you have again the reference frame. So from this perspective here, so from frame number 0, they should look as if they didn't change at all. So we set reference frame 0. Obviously, we could also set here reference frame 243, because here this is also exactly this perspective. Yeah? Doesn't matter here. And now we say we have a minimum offset. Let's say the letters can move up to 500 pixels to the camera, and let's say they can move up to 1000 pixels away from the camera. And again, we have our offset multiplier. That's the same as with the autoscale. And I just select all of these text layers now and click on apply, and note what happens with them in 3D space. Now you can see they are all crazily moved to the back and to the front. Yeah, this letter here came a bit to the front. These were all moved to the back up to 1000 pixels. And if you don't like this particular random distribution, you can choose another randomness value here. So you have this randomness setting, and here's a random seed in this I expression. And if you just change this to an arbitrary other number, let's say 1, and apply it again, it will distribute them randomly again, completely different. And you can see now these letters here all came more to the front, and the camera bundle randomly moved a bit to the back. But the interesting thing is really, if you rotate this back to the original perspective, then the layers really look as if they were all laying in one plane. Yeah, all seem to have the same size and the same distance to the camera. But now, if we do a little RAM preview of this part here, you can see that by no means they are all lying in the same depth level, but they have actually very different depth levels. Yeah, you can see these here in the front are pretty small and close to the camera, and these here are larger and more far away from the camera. And you can create these interesting transitions with the help of this expression, and very easily just choose the range, how much you want to distribute your letters in 3D space. Again, as with the other autoscale expression, once you're happy with the distribution of the layers, you can just go to one frame with your work area, say or select for all of these the position and rotation. Let me move this here, and again select all of these text layers, hit EE to reveal only the expression properties, so the properties to which the expressions are applied. And then I select all of them and click on Bake. And this will generate keyframes for all these expressions, which makes them calculate much faster. And since we have only one keyframe here essentially, you can also afterwards click the stopwatch to get rid of it. And now all the expressions are nicely baked into position and scale values, and your layers are nicely distributed in 3D space. So very nice to get these kinds of text effects. That's it. My name is Matthias from mamoworld.com. I'm looking forward to see you again in the next tutorial.